Good afternoon and welcome to the University of Pittsburgh University Center for International Studies. I'm Alison Belnor. I'm the Interim Director of the European Studies Center, and on behalf of my colleagues who we're cooperating with, the Center for Russian and East European Studies, we welcome you to this latest installment of Conversations on Europe. Today we are going to be talking about electoral interference in the US and Europe. And for that we have assembled quite a panel whom I'm going to introduce in just a moment. First, I'd like to thank our institutional partners who are joining us from Florida International University in Miami, from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and from Georgia Tech University. Thank you all for your cooperation. We hope you enjoy this conversation. Our panel today, which will be discussing our topic, will be moderated by, on my left, Sean Gilroy. Dr. Gilroy received his PhD from UCLA and is now an affiliate at the Center for Russian and East European Studies here at Pitt. He is an active blogger and host of the successful podcast, Sean's Russia Blog Podcast, which features weekly interviews. He's also a regular commentator on Russia for a variety of media outlets, and we're so pleased that he agreed to do this for us today. For our panel, unfortunately, as advertised, Dr. Dunn from GISPIA here at Pitt will not be able to join us for health reasons, but we do still have a fabulous panel, and I'm looking forward to hearing from each one of them. In no particular order, Dr. John Denny, a research professor of joint, interagency, intergovernmental, and multinational security studies at the Strategic Studies Institute at the U.S. Army War College, will be joining us. He's also a former political advisor for senior U.S. military commanders in Europe. Look forward to his insights on this topic. Dr. Helga Drux is joining us from Williams College in Massachusetts. She's a professor of German, working on German literature with a specialization in immigration and nationalisms. She's also co-edited a volume with Patricia Ann Simpson on extreme cultures, right-wing politics, and popular media in Europe and North America, and can add this great perspective to our discussion today. And finally, Dr. Florian Hartlev is joining us. He's an independent scholar and consultant. He's been a commentator in media, in a variety of media outlets on populism in Europe, refugee crisis, and terrorism. He's also an expert on digital society, particularly in Estonia. I'm so pleased that you are all able to join us, and I'm looking forward to this topic enormously. And so that we can get right to it, I'm going to hand it over to our moderator.
Okay. I thought I'd open with a couple of comments, just trying to set some context to what we're going to discuss, and particularly thinking about the last 15, 16, even 17 years. Because in many respects, it seems that we're in some uncharted territory, especially since if you consider that at the end of the Cold War, there was a feeling that that liberal democracy was triumphant, and we can go into these various quite idealistic understandings of the end of history and whatnot. But I think it's safe to say that liberal democracy was seen ascendant. The successful development of liberal democracies in Soviet satellite states or ex-Soviet satellite states, though ex-Soviet republics were a different issue. But I think in the last 15 years or so, we've seen an emergence of a continuum of crises. And I want to point out in two spheres. First, in the United States, which by all intents and purposes is the core power of the liberal democratic order. And here, if you think about it, we have several crises. First, I think the Bush-Gore election in 2000 set off the initiation, I think, of some of the political difficulties we're dealing with now in terms of the repeated destabilization of elections in the United States. Then, of course, we have September 11th, 2001, which launched the United States into a so-called global war on terrorism that really hit home with the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And we all know that invasion was based on to put it mildly, faulty information. Then, of course, we have the 2008 Great Recession, which, if the Bush-Gore election put the first strike in the liberal democratic order in the United States, the Great Recession put a crisis in the global economic order of liberal democracy, of capitalism. Interestingly enough, though, in 2008, we also had the election of Barack Obama, the United States' first black president, which has a lot of important historical, I think, points. But it also unleashed a quite destabilizing political backlash in the United States, in the sense that it further polarized not only the electorate, but a lot of the representatives within the American government. And I think we saw some of this most vividly, of course, in this year's electoral campaign in 2016, where you have the emergence of two candidates, Bernie Sanders on the one hand on the left, and of course now President-elect Trump on the right, that circumvented or at least challenged the establishment order of American politics. Now, these continuum of crises in the United States had issues, other crises abroad that also contributed to them and fed into them. First and foremost, of course, I think, and this is our main issue today, is the reemergence of Russia as a regional and global power. The establishment of a stable Russian political regime under Vladimir Putin, the continuance of his rule, and the establishment of an authoritarian system, part of which, of course, was shaken to some extent 5 years ago in the elections in 2011, 2012, but it weathered them and, in fact, became more aggressive and assertive after that. We also have the wave of revolutions and uprisings in post-Soviet space, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, Ukraine in 2004, and then, of course, Ukraine again in 2014, and also the Arab Spring in the Middle East. Now, for some, this provided a positive push, a reassertion of the liberal democratic order, that despite the crises that one may experience in, say, the United States or even Europe, there are still states that are aspiring for that type of governance. But of course, these revolutions to some extent devolved into civil war, destabilization, the rise of terrorist organizations like ISIS, political Islamism, and of course the current refugee crisis and the continuing refugee crisis. Within the EU itself, you had economic crises in terms of Greece and of course most recently Brexit. You had Russia's exercising of military might with its annexation of Crimea, its military intervention in eastern Ukraine, and most recently in Syria. The rise of right-wing populism in Europe, another topic that we'll deal with today. Again, if the polarization in the American system is a fact, you have another increasing challenge to the liberal democratic order in Europe as well, in the form of right-wing populism, but also to some extent even left-wing populism, but on a lesser scale if you think of, say, Spain and Greece. And lastly, the general communicative context for all of this, the transformation of the global media landscape, the role of social media, both as a force in revolutionary change and uprisings, but also as a means to combat it, something that Russia has done quite effectively, I think, since 2012. And of course, the emergence of cyber warfare, hacking, leaks to the media, also adding another layer to a challenge, or at least trying to destabilize and delegitimize liberal democracy in the West. So to start our discussion, I have several questions I'd like to pose, but I think the first question I'd like to put out there is, what are these challenges that we're facing as you see them for liberal democracy? And to what extent do you think that this represents a general crisis of representation that, say, states like Russia are taking advantage of?
Okay. So one of the big changes I see is it's harder to get an educated citizenry now because of the rise of social media. Most people now are getting their news from social media. That's a very speeded up news cycle. Fact checking is therefore also very speeded up. And what's different between getting your news from social media, say like Facebook feeds or blogs, versus traditional news sites, is that the content you actually see is based on your previous clicks and the previous information you've consumed and liked. So you're in fact not getting a non-curated, you're getting an access that's highly tailored to your specific predilections, and that doesn't make you better informed. So I think that's a big problem, because most people aren't really keenly aware of this and are just consuming these things on social media as if they were all equally true. So there isn't as much of a sensitization until just very recently to the existence of fake news and how much they influence our perception as voters and citizens. Did they hear that?
Florian?
Yes. The biggest challenge basically is that the waters are obviously not predictable. That we are speaking about the citizens in Asia, that there is somehow a kind of dissatisfaction with the tools and mechanism of the representative democracies. And it's very hard to find out why it is like that. Is it kind of globalization or modernization crisis? Is it maybe a luxury problem? Is it a kind of welfare chauvinism? Is it the new hostility against the new flow of migrants due also to the refugee crisis? Especially it's a European or German problem, which came out in the autumn 2015. So it's not clear yet what's actually the reason for, but it seems that citizens are not satisfied with the political decision-making processes anymore.
And we go to John somehow, hopefully.
Can you try again, John?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yeah,
Yes.
okay, good.
How exciting.
Hi, sorry about that. Yeah, my name is John Denny. I'm from the U.S. Army War College. Sean, thank you so much for hosting, and Allison, thank you, and the University of Pittsburgh for inviting me. I'm eager to engage in the discussion, but I must begin by saying that the views I express are mine and mine alone and don't reflect those of the U.S. Army or the U.S. government. Now, with regard to the questions you've asked, Sean, yeah, we certainly do seem to be in a crisis of representation right now. I'm not sure, though, if I would draw out that crisis in terms of its, at least its beginning point is 15 or 16 years ago. Because I think, as you yourself highlighted, there are really countervailing data points. And I think if we take a step back and look more broadly today, we see that the success that we saw in the 1990s in terms of liberal democratic orders being the form of government that most countries or many countries around the world have chosen in the wake of the Cold War is still the case. We've not seen significant backsliding across most of Europe, certainly not in North America, despite the recent election and the influence of Russians in that election. We could talk about that further, or elsewhere. And in fact, we've seen perhaps an expansion of that community if we were to look at Latin America, for example, or countries in Africa. The Arab Spring is also a good example. Of course, a mixed record of success there, very mixed. But in my view, this crisis of representation that we see going on, at least right now in America and in Europe, is a function of two different but related set of circumstances. In Europe, it seems to me we've got a lack of connection between the electorate and the intergovernmental structures and mechanisms available. That is, the EU and its tools. There are, frankly, I think, too many layers between the average EU citizen and decision makers and policymakers within the EU. That lack of connection is then exploited by fringe elements. And this is the second set of circumstances I would point to. These fringe elements or fringe parties of both the right and the left are able to exploit the lack of problem solving in terms of economic policy largely on the part of the moderate or centrist parties of both the right and the left. And so the electorates naturally, when they don't find solutions in the center, they go to the fringes, either right or left. And those fringes are very willing and able to blame all manner of problems on the intergovernmental structures. Now, we see a similar dynamic playing out, I think, in the US, but of course it's slightly different. Here we have a lack of connection between our central government, our federal government, and American citizens. Okay, so we see again and again in America this phenomenon where most Americans, when polled, say they dislike Washington and the Congress, but they love their congressman, right? There's a fundamental problem there, right? There's a bit of cognitive disassociation there that we can't really explain very easily. At the same time, we have a fringe element in America, known here as the Tea Party, that has risen up within the Republican Party, is now, judging by our most recent election, a full-scale rival with the establishment wing of the Republican Party for dominance within that party, that is very willing and able to blame the central government for all manner of problems, regardless of the accuracy of those claims. So again, I see this lack of connection between citizens and central authorities, as well as a willingness and ability of fringe elements to highlight the central government as the problem, central authority as the problem.
Yeah, so I see essentially three issues here that you've all brought out. First off, as Helga raises, the issue of the media and how people consume information and how they understand the information and how it represents the world around them. So I think to a large extent, our interaction with the world outside of us is very mediated, and it's increasingly mediated by, say, social media. And the thing with that, of course, is now that social media, because of the algorithms that it uses, it creates our own self-contained bubble. But at the same time, I would suggest that while we can point to people using social media and consuming their news and not having verifiable news and the role of fake news, I think it's worth also considering the fact that this is the very model of media today. This is a media model that has been perpetrated by the people we're supposed to go to for information. This is the model for profit in the media landscape. So in a way, I would suggest thinking about it not as an aberration, but as an extension of the very system itself. Second is the question of dissatisfaction and disconnection between citizens and government that both Florian and John raised. And with Florian, it's interesting because we still are grappling with why. Why do citizens feel this way? Why do they feel alienated? Why do they feel that they're not represented? Why is it, the issues of the political and economic order? Is it globalization? And also what John points out, which is the connection between state institutions or governmental institutions and the electorate, and how this lack of connection opens up the space for fringe elements to come in and fill that gap. Now, I think, John, you're absolutely correct in pointing out the fact that in terms of the liberal democratic order, there hasn't been much backsliding. In fact, there's been an increase in states that have adopted or at least attempted to adopt these types of political forms. But at the same time, there seems to be a fundamental contradiction within that order in its inability to reestablish or maintain the connections to its electorate, and why they are not, at least the representatives of the quote-unquote establishment, either cannot or are reluctant to maintain those connections. Anyone can jump in. Yes, Florian.
Yeah, first of all, there is not that electorate. We have to face some big problems. The big problems is basically the elections are not predictable, neither from the intellectuals nor from the opinion poll experts, from the political consultants, from all the so-called foreseers. The problem is basically, if you look at the United States elections, In Washington, D.C., everybody would have voted, I think, 93% for Hillary Clinton. The same would be in Brussels or in Berlin. And you see the big gap between the cosmopolitan area and the big centers and the rural areas. And this is a big gap we are facing, which is very hard to predict the elections. And we see in the United States and as well in Europe the tendency that basically the right-wing populists are getting the support from the rural areas. That somehow the people, they lost the connection to the big politics. And this is the problem. And also another thing is somehow the intellectuals are not able somehow to create a vision which somehow creates a support and the trust in the democracies. And the EU is doing quite many efforts in that, but somehow it doesn't bring the real results. Yeah? The turnout went down, and we saw the Brexit campaign. Basically, that EU was more or less silent, but the big campaign against the EU was from Boris Johnson and from Nigel Farage. We said there was Hitler, there was Napoleon, and now it's EU. So it was a big, actually manipulation strategy, and it worked out at the end of the day.
Helga or John, do you have comments? Yes, Helga.
I would say that it's not just a failure of the elites, the political elites or the intellectuals to translate their vision for democracy, but it's also that they're encountering a trend of anti-intellectualism, a distrust of experts and elites and career politicians. I can best speak for the case of Pegida supporters in Germany, the right populist group. Many of their supporters are also interested in the Alternative for Germany, the AfD party that formed after Pegida. And these groups and this party really promote a distrust of career politicians. And I think that's a big problem, because people feel that they should have that they should influence politics by direct street protests and mandates, like surveys or popular mandate, direct voting process, rather than referring to democratically elected representatives as before. There's a great distrust of that now.
John?
Yeah, I think Florian makes a very good point. You know, we have to be careful about when we talk about the electorate losing its connection, or when I spoke of voters not having a connection, we have to be careful about what do we mean by the electorate. It's difficult to define this group. It seems to me that the polling can be accurate, assuming those who are polled actually show up to vote. And I think that is the challenge, not in the polling models per se, but in our models of likely voters. And so that is the great challenge. We can look at the election, for example, of Donald Trump as a case point here, where it seemed pretty clear from exit polls that there were certain groups of voters in certain key states that did not turn out in the numbers that were necessary for Hillary Clinton to win in some of these key states. Now, I think if that had happened, we'd be having a very different discussion today. We wouldn't be talking about this disconnection. But I guess what I'm getting at is kind of a critique of my own argument, and that is namely that we have to carefully caveat when we describe this disconnect that's going on between certain elements of our societies and our countries in the West and the central government institutions. I don't think we can make broad brush assumptions or conclusions here in this regard.
Yeah. I want to bring Russia into this, since this is, I think we've established some of the issues with the general context. And what we have seen is Russia engaging in, for lack of a better term, meddling in both say, in its Baltic or border states, in the politics of its border states, or at least we can most visibly clear in Ukraine. But also it's been doing this in Georgia. There's some suspicions of it, and also some actual operations in, say, Estonia, particularly in 2008. And of course, most recently, we've seen the Putin government giving loans, or at least supporting fringe right-wing elements in Europe. And of course, now with the hacking and issues with the United States and the suspected leak by the Russians of material to WikiLeaks. And we just went through an election cycle in the United States. We will have an election cycle in Germany and one in France. It's interesting to note that in the French case, Russia's RT network just received the budget boost to create a French operation, a French outlet, just in time for the elections in France. So I guess the question is I think a general one is, what do you three make of Russia's role here? What are they trying to achieve? And do you think that they've been effective? And to what extent? Let's start with Helga.
I think what's very troubling is Russia's support of fringe right parties all across Europe. They've reached out not only with 40 million euro bank loans to the Front National, which I think you already mentioned. And obviously, a party can do much more work nationally if they have that kind of funding. That incidentally was refused them. They couldn't get these bank loans from French or Belgian banks, and the Russians did give it to them right away. Then the fact that Russia TV, which you mentioned, RT, is financed by the Russian state. A third arm where the Russian government or Russian state tries to do funding is through cultural organizations. In Berlin, for instance, there's a thing called the Tolstoy Society that has been receiving fringe right Reichsbürger, like a German group that has its own passport and doesn't pay taxes or tries not to pay taxes, and you know, is very anti-modern and nationalistic, and they've been inviting. To these cultural events at the Tolstoy Institute, they've been inviting mainstream party politicians who often didn't do their homework and didn't, were then showed up and were then used as advertising for policies and political, fringe groups that they totally don't want to endorse, but they were sort of conned into it through participation at what they thought were purely cultural friendship events. So I think there's just a multi-pronged effort to fund populist fringe right parties that Russia has been engaging in. And this is a Putin, I think this is a long-held desire. We shouldn't forget that Putin is an ex-KGB man who's very, very disappointed by who was very disappointed by the falling apart of the Soviet Union, and he's trying to bring back or redistrict a new political entity he calls Eurasia. He's very influenced. I can't get into all this in detail now, but others like Marlène Laruelle, a political scientist at George Washington University, or Timothy Snyder, the historian at Yale, or Alex Mihailovich, have worked on Alexander Dugin, a Russian ideologue who talks about this new political entity that Putin is trying to create, this new Eurasian policy of a kind of a new colonialism, if you will, that involves destabilizing democratic governments in Western Europe and gaining more influence over Western Europe and over parts of Asia.
John?
Thanks, Sean. I think that I would begin my remarks on Russia with two key points. First, some context. I think we need to remember that what Russia is engaging in is frankly nothing new. In fact, one could argue it was much worse in the 1920s and 1930s when many of our, in the United States, in the West, we had a much more benign view of what communism was all about, particularly Soviet communism. As we know then, the Russians and then the Soviets were very active all through the Cold War in trying to influence elections all over Europe and, frankly, in many places around the world. And so I see this as really part of that ongoing trend. In the most recent iteration of this, that is what Putin has done over the last couple of years, it seems to me that there are two objectives that Putin is trying to, or that Russia is trying to achieve. And I'll corrected myself there on purpose. This goes beyond Putin, I believe. I think my own study of Russian history and culture and politics leads me to believe that if Putin were to die tomorrow, we would see very similar behavior on the part of the Kremlin, regardless of who's running it. And I think that is driven by two factors. One is a desire to shape the international landscape around Russia, right? And this is tied to Russia's geopolitical situation in the world. That is, although geography is not determinate, Russia is, of course, a land power primarily that has, for the most part, poorly defended borders or defendable borders, and a geography or a history of conflict with neighbors on its west, its south, and to its east. So there's a concern with the other, with foreigners in general, that drives some of this. But I think we can't lose sight of the fact that this is also a policy used instrumentally by Putin to achieve domestic political objectives. Russian policymakers are not incentivized domestically to view the world in these liberal international tones that we in the West do. The best way we can summarize this in the West is that a rising tide lifts all boats, right? This sense that former enemies need to reconcile in order for all of us to get along and to do better, economically, politically, culturally, etc. That is not the view within Russia. And instead, there's a much more competitive approach taken toward its neighbors and especially toward the West. As such, in terms of domestic politics, politicians there are incentivized in terms of electoral success to treat the West in these competitive terms. And that is why I think we're seeing really this continuing trend of Russian efforts to shape the international landscape, including by interfering in elections.
Florian?
I think basically that somehow the so-called information war from Russia is an answer to the economic crisis what they are facing, and also maybe the answer of the economic sanctions. So basically Russia was excluded, and now they are playing a very effective media influential strategy towards the West in many dimensions. So, for example, all the channels like Russia Today and Sputnik and so on, they are, for example, already very influential in Germany. So, or in France and other Western European countries with the disinformation. With these channels, for example, they also can attract the Russian Germans. There was a case that Russian media were reported that one 13-year-old girl was raped in Berlin, the so-called Lisa case. It was totally disinformation. And then thousands of Russian Germans in Berlin and in other cities and villages in Germany went to the street and demonstrated against this. And also, there's a new kind of connection between Russia and the radical right in Europe. So, for example, not only France, what was mentioned, but also in Austria, the presidential candidate Norbert Hofer, he got almost elected. He got 48% of the votes, and 2 weeks later, he went with the Freedom Party of Austria to Moscow and signed a contract, long-term contract with Putin's party United Russia to educate the youth in the sense of patriotism, so that networking with the right-wing populist parties in Europe. And I think this works out very well because the established parties are under fire, what we discussed already now, and also now they have the chance to unify all the big friends of Russia, like Nigel Farage, who is at the same time big fan of Donald Trump. So it can be that will be a new axis against the West and against the traditional order of politics. And I think they're playing it quite well. And I think it's really a big danger for the EU and also for the transatlantic relations, which we know, and which was actually very optimistic in the sense of Francis Fukuyama, that we have the liberal order and that's it.
And John, you had something to add?
Yes. Yeah, I just wanted to jump off of Florian's opening comments there about what is going on right now in terms of the Kremlin's attempts to try to draw attention to the West and try to influence the West. I think we need to remember that in the long run, while in the short run, Russia is very much a threatening power to the West, in the long run, Russia remains a state in decline. We can examine this from the perspective of demographics, where Russia continues to struggle with issues of brain drain, with replacing its aging population. We can look at this in terms of economics, where Putin has frankly failed utterly in trying to diversify the Russian economy, which remains entirely dependent upon resource extraction. We can look at this militarily, where there are some areas of the Russian military that have developed very successfully, but the Russian military remains dependent upon conscripts, very poorly trained, poorly motivated conscripts. Anyway, across all of these measures, we can see that Russia in the long run is a state that is probably in decline, especially vis-a-vis the West. However, and for that reason, in the short run, the Kremlin needs to do whatever it can to distract Russian citizenry from the increased cost of daily life, from the decreasing standard of living there, etc. And it's been very successful, I think, again, for largely electoral reasons within Russia. It has sought to turn attention away from those domestic problems and aim them toward these overseas challenges, blaming everything on conspiracies in the West, etc.
I'd like to take the opportunity to. Oh, you have something to add, Helga?
If I could, I think we should also be aware that at the level of the European Parliament, the fact that Russia gives funds to these various far-right parties, in as much as they're represented in the European Parliament, they make transnational alliances. And so when resolutions come up to a vote at the European Parliament level, they can influence these resolutions in a pro-Russia direction. Regarding the Russian invasion of Crimea, for instance, or regarding resolutions about Ukraine. They've been very successful at swaying voting at that level.
I'd like to actually open it up to some questions from the audience to get them into the conversation. Does anybody have any questions or comments? No? Okay, I want to go back to the question of, this is, the Russian government has all sorts of desires, and they engage in all sorts of things to put forward their goals. And especially if we consider it as John proposed, that Russian attempts to influence elections has a very long history, at least in the 20th century. And one has to question, if we think of it as over the long term, how successful they've been, particularly when it comes to the West. And do you think that while they are doing all of these things with Russia today, and which I actually have a lot of suspicion whether they're actually effective at all, or even if they have an audience, but just from some of the people I know who watch it quite closely. But do you think they are effective Why are they effective if you think they're effective? And do you think that effectiveness is more because of Russia's methods or because of the general context that we've been talking about? John?
Well, I think to tie this back to what Helga was mentioning, we have seen this sort of behavior on the part of the Russians previously, right, to influence not just political parties right now within the EU Parliament, but Russian efforts to influence and to really direct, in many cases, the activities of communist parties at the state levels. Speaking specifically of the communist parties in Italy and in France, I mean, it was very clear, we know now, that they were often getting marching orders directly from Moscow. It seems to me that at that time, at least, Russians, the Kremlin was frankly unsuccessful. And the West went through this similar sort of crisis of confidence, realizing, first of all, what the problem was, and then taking steps to try to manage that problem politically, economically, and so forth.
Are you speaking of the 1960s?
Exactly, and even earlier.
Yeah, I want to get a timeline. Okay.
Even earlier, 1950s, late 1940s, when democracy was really just becoming consolidated in some countries in Western Europe. So today, I think we face a very, very similar challenge. Whether the extent to whether and how Russia is successful, I don't know if I would go so far as some folks have, John Lewis, most notably this past weekend, in saying that, really the election is illegitimate. I mean, I think a careful reading of all the available data points to multiple factors that, at least in the American case, explain the election of Donald Trump. And the role of Russia, clearly, they did play a role, but I'm not so sure it was determinative. I'm not so sure we could even count it as the top three reasons why Trump won. Perhaps with the benefit of time, we'll have the ability to go back and better assess this in a couple of years. But at this stage, it seems to me, again, it's a tactic employed by a long-term declining power, perhaps even an asymmetric tactic, we might think of it as, and that is namely a tactic used by the weak against the stronger. And not even one that's very effectively used, at least as we can tell right now.
Florian?
Yeah, let's face it, basically. There's nobody, I don't know any expert who seriously discussed before 2014, before the occupation of Kremlin and also the war in Ukraine, seriously that Russia can have an influence to United States, even elections, and also to Europe, in the sense of all the big elections, even with the rise of the right-wing populists. There was no discussion before 2014, so it's less than 3 years, about somehow the connection between Marine Le Pen or the Freedom Party of Austria with Russia. So we are actually challenging a totally new discussion, and it's a very serious threat. And I don't know any of all the populists, the experts on the populist nationalism in Europe, United States, like Kasmede, Paul Taggart, and so on. Nobody has even discussed it. So we are in a totally different stage of asking some questions. And this is already a big step forward. And a big threat, basically, I would say.
Helga?
As regards Europe, the Russian support of far-right parties in so many different countries is really a serious threat. The good news is that this has become well documented by trustworthy media sources, so you can really read up on Russian support for Lega Nord, for the Jobbik party, for Golden Dawn in Greece, and how this is playing out, that there is this support, and how this is really a ramified network of influence taking in all manner of Western European countries. And I think it's really good that this is out in the open. What worries me here about the US is that we are only slow, I think, to wake up to these Russian strategies. It bothers me a great deal when I read, say, an essay by Walter Kern in the New Harper's saying this is just another conspiracy theory that Russia hacked the elections or that Russia was attempting to influence the American election. He just essentially dismisses this as just another conspiracy theory. And I don't think that that's really accurate given what the experience we've had with Russia in Europe.
Any questions from anyone? Oh, John. Oh, you have something. Thanks. John?
Yes, sorry. Yeah, I don't want to give the impression that I'm trying to say there's no threat here. Clearly, there's a threat. I've argued, I've written that it's obvious, I think, to most everybody, most objective, informed observers that, in fact, the Russians did play some role in the U.S. election and have played a role in German politics and are gearing up to do that again in the Netherlands in March, France in April and May, and Germany in September, as well as a number of other elections across Europe and other countries. What I mean, though, is that we need to remember our history. And the fact is we have seen this behavior before on the part of Russia, on the part of the Kremlin, frankly, at a time when Russia was a much greater threat, an existential threat to Europe and to capitalism and the West as we know it in the 1950s and 60s. Much stronger country back then at that time. I think the big takeaway from what we've seen most recently with Russia again turning to this tactic that has served it with mixed results over the last 50, 60, 70 years, the big takeaway is that the policy or strategy the West has had toward Russia over the last 25 years of engagement, partnership, and pulling Russia into the West, that has utterly failed. And I think we need to realize in the West that our efforts to employ our liberal democratic solutions of reconciling with former enemies, that does not work with regard to Russia and the Kremlin. And in fact, we need a much more competitive approach than what we see now. Now, that is anathema to any parties left of center in Europe. And I'm speaking specifically now, or looking specifically at the SPD in Germany. Until we can get these center-left parties on board with the notion that Russians will not be partners and will never be partners, this is going to continue to be a problem, a major challenge for us to manage in the West.
Before I get to you, Florian, a question?
Yeah, my name's JJ Spoon. I'm in the political science department here at Pitt. So, John, this kind of just follows up on some of the things that you've been saying. I think we also need to remember that the U.S. has historically had opinions and one might say been involved in the elections and selection of leaders in other countries as well, especially during the Cold War. So I think that's something that hasn't come up, but I think that's something either in this discussion or, of course, definitely has not come up in any of the popular discussions of this, but I think that's something that's important to kind of keep in mind also, too, that we are not innocent in this either, historically.
Quick response.
Sure, that's an excellent point. I've written that as well. In fact, I haven't done the actual calculations, but there's a political scientist, and I can't recall where now, who's actually done the math and has shown that since the early 20th century, the U.S. has far exceeded the number of elections it has tried to influence around the world in comparison to the Kremlin. You're right, we've got a rich history of this, and in some cases very overt. You think about Chile and Allende, or about Iran in 1953, or even the Soviet Union when Wilson deployed Marines to fight on the side of white Russia in the Russian Civil War. What we don't like, of course, is thinking that we might be victims of that, right? So this is why we get our hackles up. And of course, most Americans have very short memories. So we don't like to think about how we might have done the same thing, but you're 100% accurate.
Florian, you had a comment to make before?
Yes. I just wanted to say that basically the Social Democrats and the so-called center-left, as John described, they lost a lot of ground to the right-wing populists because of the so-called working-class authoritarianism. All the data showing that we are thinking mostly that in Europe that the rise of the right-wing populists is somehow a product of the center-right. But in many countries, also in France, Austria, it's also a consequence of the weakness of the Social Democrats. And this means basically that this pro-European, anti-Russian, center-left, the Social Democrats, Labour Party also in UK is another example, they are losing a lot of ground to the pro-Russian right-wing populists. Also, this was the consequence was the Brexit. Due to the Conservatives and also to the UKIP party. This is a big problem. If we would have seen in Germany, we would have voted. In Germany, it was a big euphoria about Barack Obama. Donald Trump got the support from maybe 4% in the German population, and especially the Social Democrats. They have a big problem to cope with the new reality, with the rise of the right-wing populists and also with the rise of the Russian influence, because the connection was, as John described, more a product of the Euro-communism and more from the more radical leftist parties. Still, they have until now a good connection, more the radical left parties like in Greece or in Spain with Russia, but not with the center left, which is basically more or less critical. But the Social Democrats lost a lot of influence, and the political landscape in Europe has changed dramatically in the last years.
Helge, did I see you wanted to add something?
Is the call to actionism on the far right and the alt-right in Europe means that disgruntled voters can more easily become violent now. I mean, we had the Pizzagate event here in the sort of non-event of this man from, what was it, Southern North Carolina, coming because of fake news and trying to shoot up this pizza restaurant in DC. On a very harmless. I've been there myself before this happened, and it's just like a very sort of suburban North Washington street. Nothing, of this conspiracy going on. But there's in Europe among voters, we've had attacks against journalists who are reporting on, say, Pegida and AFD. We've had attacks against ministers. I don't know if people remember in 17 October 2015 in Cologne, the mayoral candidate Henriette Reker was stabbed in the neck and was attacked at a party recruiting event she was holding downtown, and was very seriously injured by a man who said, a right-wing voter who said, "I had to do it, I'm protecting you all." And there's this kind of moral panic fomented, this endangerment scenario that's often linked to white nationalism of wanting to protect women and children by attacking journalists, by attacking politicians. And I think this call to violence that actually results in acts of criminal violence is very troubling.
Any questions or comments? Yeah, go ahead, yes.
Hi, my name is Katie Pompiani. I'm in the anthropology department at Pitt. I'm a graduate student. Kind of going back to the fake news and the Russia, whether or not they had an involvement in influencing the US election through the hacking. Do you think a lot of this is, this coordinated effort that's coming down directives from the central government, or if it's more opportunistic? So I'm thinking of in Macedonia, it came out that there was a group of teenagers in Veles in central Macedonia that just essentially entrepreneurs who realized they could make a lot of money by creating these fake news sites directed towards far-right sympathies in the United States. So in that, it's kind of this decentralized, it's not actually tied to anyone. What is your take on that?
Let's get a couple of questions.
So that's a good question. I want to hear the answer.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I'm Viktor Vajevic. I'm an undergraduate student in the history and German departments. And I had a question regarding Denny's point as to Russia's previous influences in external politics. That if we put Russia under Putin and their efforts to influence elections and politics abroad in the context of the Soviet Union, are we risking bringing too many negative connotations of the Soviet Union into Russia today, and assuming that their intentions are similar?
Heva, why don't you, since you're on the screen, why don't you give a response if you have one? Did you hear? There.
Sorry, what?
Helga?
Oh yeah, hi. Sorry, I wasn't sure what's going on. Well, I think one should be very critical of Putin, and one can't assume that there is no carryover from his KGB days to today. So I think there's plenty of negative connotations if one looks at Putin's Russia today. I agree that a lot of his interference in the West creates stronger nationalism at home and stronger support domestically. And that's a large part of why we have to assume he's doing this. Yeah, I mean, I also think a factor we haven't mentioned is in Europe, there's, at least in the case of Germany, there's in other countries, there's also some dependence on Russian oil and gas. And that may, that certainly influenced our treatment of Putin previously when the Social Democrats were in power. Schröder, after he stepped down as chancellor, became, involved very directly on the board of Gazprom, I believe. So there's also economic considerations of basically dependence on gas and oil from Russia in Europe that may influence how people react.
Do you have a comment about the media decentralization, this Macedonian incident?
Well, I haven't researched this deeply, but my understanding is this bunch of highly skilled teenagers was paid. I mean, they weren't just doing this opportunistically on their own. They were hired for that. Russia operates troll factories and is very, I think, just very smart about hiring out disinformation efforts, online disinformation efforts to all kinds of people. And this was just one more instance of that.
John, you had a response?
Yeah, on this question of whether there's central direction, it seems clear from the available evidence that, in fact, there was, right? That's what the findings of this unclassified intelligence report lead us to believe, that, in fact, Putin himself signed off on this. I think one of the most interesting aspects of this is to note that one of the findings in that report was that you had two very different intelligence organizations within Russia. That is the GRU, the military intelligence, and FSB, basically the successor to the KGB, or their central intelligence agency, were both pursuing the same objectives. That is digging into the political system in America, right? Trying to gain information that could be exploited in some way or leaked in some way, and that neither knew what the other was doing, okay? Because they both went after some of the same information, and so it seems to our intelligence community as if the right hand did not know what the left hand was doing. Now, if you're a fan of Graham Allison's Essence of Decision, as I am, you'll understand that this is what happens sometimes in large bureaucracies like the Russian government, or even within our own government sometimes, right? One of the major critiques of the 9/11 Commission was that in our own government, our intelligence entities didn't know information. They didn't share information with each other. Same thing happens in Russia very clearly, and this provides evidence that that's the case. And so it seems to me there is central direction going on, and they're willing and able to exploit information from any source. And then secondly, with regard to maybe conflating, the risks of conflating Russia with the Soviet Union, you're right, we have to be careful about doing that, but the aspect or the characteristics that matter most to me between Russia and the Soviet Union are these geopolitical ones. So Russia and the Soviet Union, to a large degree, occupy the same space. They face the same geopolitical situation, that is, with regard to their neighbors and the environment, the geopolitical environment. Russia, as a successor state to the Soviet Union, hasn't relocated to Antarctica. It's still where it is. It still faces the same problems, challenges with regards to neighbors to the west, the south, and the east. And upon that basis, it's upon that basis that I make the argument that a lot of these same political, domestic political incentives are at play, whether we're talking about the Soviet Union or Russia. And that's why I think that we can expect to see this play out even beyond the personalities involved now, that is beyond Putin.
Florian, do you have a comment?
One aspect we should also take into account is the role of Russia in Syria. I mean, we are facing a very big mess in the Middle East. Yeah, the big euphoria with the so-called Arab Spring is over, and you see the growing Russian influence in Syria, and also this is part of the so-called information war. If you are watching Russia Today, and also the fake news. And I think this is also a big problem for the Western world, because it's also kind of a failure of the American foreign policy. And also it's linked with a big question mark, what's going on with the new Trump strategy there. The other point is with the fake news and the US elections, we don't know how far it goes, but if you see the voices of the opposition, and I spoke a few months ago with Garry Kasparov, which is one of the biggest opponents of Putin, very without any influence in Russia, but with a big influence in US and in other countries. He is saying basically that the situation right now in Russia is worse than the Soviet Union, but we don't know that. I mean, we have a big question mark around these things, and we can only speculate. I'm missing the data, also when I'm observing or analyzing the reports from journalists.
Does anybody have any questions on remote locations? It's hard to see your hands or anything. Well, if there's a question, wave frantically. So the picture we painted from my trying to pull all of this together is, on the one hand, there seems to be an agreement that there is a crisis within Western societies in terms of politics. We spoke of disconnection. We spoke of difficulty in trying to even the experts understanding Western societies. We have a distrust of experts. We have a distrust of information. We have media platforms that perpetuate unreliable information, if not put us in our own bubble. So there is a problems within Western societies in Europe and the United States. And then on the other hand, we have Russia engaging in all sorts of machinations to exploit, push, divide, and to foment this crisis. Now, the question is, what is to be done? Because on the one hand, my fear is that in an effort to point to the Russian threat, we also could possibly engage in an act of displacement, in the sense of, instead of dealing with our own house, we displace the problems onto the other. And therefore, the problems within our own house becomes actually about getting rid of the other rather than dealing with the self. So my question is, how do we deal with both of these issues while maintaining some sobriety and clarity as to the actual problems. John, we'll start with you.
I hinted at in my earlier remarks the fact that, in my view, one of the solutions, not the only one, but one of the solutions to this challenge is to dramatically shift Western strategy toward Russia. The approach that we've taken was one that we in the West view as very successful in the aftermath of World War II. That is cooperation, partnership, integration, and interdependence. That strategy hasn't worked with regard to Russia. I think what we need to focus on in the West now is developing a new strategy that removes or diminishes the Kremlin's ability to hold vital Western interests at threat. How do you do that? Well, one of the ways in which we need to do that, I think, is, again, first of all, to understand that we're not going to turn Russia into some version of Poland or Italy or Germany, right? That's simply not going to happen. And instead, we need to diminish the ability of Russia to wield its economic, military, energy, diplomatic, political, media, cyber tools in threatening Western interests. Now, part of that strategy gets at what you're speaking at, Sean. Also looking internally, right? A good strategy always matches ends with ways and means. And so if we can modify the ends, that is to view Russia more competitively and to view our goal as diminishing Russian power in all of these areas, we can then look at all of the means and ways we have available to us to accomplish that. And that will necessarily involve a look internally at what is going on economically as well as politically within our individual member states, as well as our intergovernmental institutions like NATO and the EU, and the kind of reforms necessary there so that we can build up the ways and means that we need to achieve our preferred ends.
Let's see, who did I go to? Florian, go ahead, yeah.
All right, it's not
Go away from this annus horribilis from the bad year 2016. The word of the year was post-truth politics. Also in Germany, so-called post-faktisches Zeitalter. And we have to go away from this debate because the weaker the West is, the stronger Russia will play it out. And of course, there's a big question mark. For example, that Twitter president and ongoing US President Trump gave interview to the German and British media just right now. And basically, he compared Angela Merkel with Putin. And basically, he said he can make a deal with both. So there's a big question mark what's going on. And Europe is in a very weak position, also due to the Brexit. And today, Theresa May, the Prime Minister, announced she wants to have a hard Brexit. So she wants to go totally out of the EU without any ties anymore. So if we are weakening ourselves in the both dimensions of the transatlantic ties of the post-war 1945 order, and as well within Europe with the weak EU, then of course Russia is gaining influence, and it's a natural consequence out of that, I would say.
Helga?
When you talk about putting our own house in order, to realize the overlaps and connections between white nationalists here in the United States and in Russia and in Europe, to see the similarities in ideology, to really understand that this isn't an isolated phenomenon to just one particular geographic area or geopolitical entity, but that we have corresponding problems here at home.
So we have a question via chat.
We do. We have a question that came in via chat, and it actually aligns with the question that I had as well.
Okay.
But one of the things you mentioned is sort of, are we risking deflecting the issue and putting it onto an enemy other? And I think, oddly, that's sort of, in how I'm saying it, it's sort of opposite of what's happened. The Russians hacked. There's information that's given from that pack. And it's not the fact that they have that's the problem. The information is being used. The information is what's being talked about. So, in possibly a related question, I'll leave it to the panel to decide. One of our viewers put in, isn't it new to have a U.S. president or president-elect defending Russia instead of criticizing it, especially on this question?
Helga, you want to answer?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me like a really bad new thing, and we have to ask, why is he doing that? We need more context for. He's never laid open his taxes and his holdings. We don't know what his business interests in Russia actually are. We need a lot more digging to go on, a lot more information to come out into the open about Trump's Russian business interests and Trump's links in Russia, because that would, I think, go a long ways to explaining his support for Putin right now.
John?
Yes, I completely agree. It is new, and it frankly is problematic, to say the least. We've never had a situation like this where, particularly a Republican president, or at least nominally Republican, right, is speaking very kindly about Russia and Putin. The reasons for that are unclear at this point. I speculated in something I wrote this past Friday at Carnegie Europe's website that one of the reasons seems to be that he's concerned about his own legitimacy, which is evidenced by, again, John Lewis's comments over the weekend as a legitimate concern. But I am very eager to see this reported investigation that may be underway, how that plays out. But I think we need to consider this as part of having a real political neophyte in office. And we're going to see similar sorts of uninformed missteps on the part of this president-elect and soon-to-be president in a variety of issue areas. Now, this one is particularly dangerous because, as I argued on Friday, this is not merely a political challenge. It undermines deterrence in Northeastern Europe, which becomes really a strategic problem for the United States and its allies. For anybody, though, who tries to map out where Trump is on Russia, he's literally all over the map. It's very difficult to pin him down. Even his advisors have a disparate set of opinions on this. I was heartened by what I heard last week in the confirmation hearings on the part of Mattis for Secretary of Defense, Mike Pompeo at CIA, and to some degree Rex Tillerson at State. But you get the sense that he, at least from Mattis, certainly is going to be hearing really the straight story when it comes to Russia and the threat that Russia poses. Now, how that will influence Trump and what he has to say remains unclear, but we can expect a very bumpy ride, not just in national security, but across an array of issue areas, because he's never been in government before. He simply doesn't know what he doesn't know. And he's unwilling to hold his tongue, even in that circumstance.
Florian?
Yeah, well, what we know between the new connection between Putin and the radical right is the mutual admiration for strong leadership. And what we can learn out of this connection is maybe that Trump is admiring Putin's leadership, that he came back and he's already a long time in power. And this is, I think, the point we have to be worrying about. So that somehow doesn't matter from which ideology or from which sides of the political side you are, this admiration for strong leadership and to make politics as simple as possible, this could actually be a ground for the new connection between Trump and Putin and also the European right. Because the point what is worrying about is that Nigel Farage and also the Dutch leader, right-wing populist leader Geert Wilders, and so on, they're all, and Marine Le Pen just was in the Trump Tower. So there is a clear connection. Marine Le Pen, who is financed in the campaigns via the Kremlin, there is a clear connection between the three parts, and it seems to be a development which is going on step by step.
any questions? Well, all three have given a lot of the things to think about and chew on. Do you have, to wrap things up, do you have any closing comments you'd like to give? Maybe just start with Florian.
Yeah, I think this is a topic which is very relevant also for your university, for your study, for your center. And I think we have many open questions, and I think it's also very important to involve students to research topics, and let's see what's going on, and to work carefully in the perspective of academia and also in the journalism against the fake news and also against this kind of half information what we all have. I think it's very important.
Helga, any closing comments?
Work again, so be very aware of the discrediting of the free press that is going on. We need to maintain a free press because that's an objective external corrective that can give us valuable information. People should, read in the press more widely and cross-check their facts. Really, we need to get back to a more activist stance from citizens about getting knowledgeable about Russia and about what's going on in Europe and worldwide. One can't just be sort of regressive and say, this is all too complex, I don't want to deal with it. That's just a really, that means you will just become a sheep, a sheep that's going to be led by an authoritarian fascistic leader. And we really don't want that happening here in the States.
And John, any closing thoughts?
My closing thought is that we see trends emerging here that are both new and yet familiar. Among the new trends, of course, is a president with no political experience, a penchant for speaking his mind before he thinks clearly, and a reluctance to let his own ignorance of certain topics act as a brake on speaking on those topics. It's very dangerous. It seems to me that the man does not understand that words matter, certainly in diplomacy and in international security. But we have some mitigating factors including history, right? We've seen this kind of Russian influence before in our communist and left-leaning parties in the West. We've seen yellow journalism before. We've seen threats to the international order before. So we have history on our side, and we can take lessons from that, I should say. And one of the other lessons, or one of the other caveats I would note is that in many respects, where Mr. Trump is with regard to some of these central pillars of our international security is not where the body politic, the American polity is. So if we look to Republicans on the Hill, many of his own advisors like Mattis and Tillerson and others, as well as Democrats, they view NATO and the commitments we've made in NATO as practically sacred. And they've been very vocal about that. And so I think we need to take some confidence from that while being vigilant about how we manage and navigate the next 4 years.
Well, thank you three for all of the information and comments and expertise. It's much needed at a time like this. So, yeah.
And
closing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are occasions at the end of these conversations on Europe where I like to leave the possibility open of reconvening sometime after we've, worked through some of these things. The elections in Europe are going to happen, and perhaps there'll be a chance for us to come together again and talk things out after some more investigation and after some more details have come through. In the meantime, this talk has been recorded and it will be up on YouTube shortly, and I will text people, or I will send people the link to that, but look for it yourself if you aren't on our mailing list. And our next conversation on Europe is on February 21st on Transgender Europe, so different topic, but we hope to see you all then as well. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.